Well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, film review. Today we're going to be talking about The Linguists. This is one of my favorite films, partially because I think that it exemplifies what it means to do anthropological research in the field, and sort of the not only what you're finding, but the experience of finding it. Um, and so I think it's a great way of looking at ethnographic research and reflexivity within the researcher's experience. The film covers a bunch of different communities around the world. We're looking at Siberia, we're looking at Bolivia, we're looking at India, we're looking at Native Americans, right? And we're going around taking a look at how these different communities are dealing with language loss, right? Because that's a lot of what this film is about, is going out and looking at these languages, trying to understand them, seeing what's happening to them and the communities that they are involved in. So I'll kind of give like a quick review about each one of these subjects and why they're important to understand, because they each have a different sort of theme to them, right? If we look at their experience in Bolivia, we're seeing that what they're looking for is a language which is a little bit unique in its own way. It's not like it's a spoken language like English or French or German or Spanish or anything like that. This is actually sort of like a technical language, right? This is a language that's not passed down through culture, but passed down from practitioner to practitioner. So this is a medical language, right? That medical language has access to the resources, the kinds of plants, the spirituality connecting to those spirits. And it also has a different sort of cadence, not because it's secretive in a way, right? That knowledge is powerful, and if everybody knows it, then it doesn't have that necessary power for that shaman to be able to use and connect to those spirits. So when you actually hear the shaman recite those words, they are unintelligible, right? No one can quite tell what it is unless you actually know that language and how to use it. So what they were trying to do was record it and to understand the words, because a lot of it deals with knowledge, both the spiritual knowledge, but also the knowledge of the natural resources, which for all intents and purposes for Western researchers is probably what they're more interested in, because the plant diversity in Bolivia is so very diverse. There's all kinds of plants there that we might not have in the United States or in Europe or in China, and they might have different medicinal uses to them. And if we can learn what those are, maybe we can come up with a new treatment or cure for another disease or something like that. So there's a big push for saving sort of like medical languages. And that's kind of what this whole segment is about, is like reaching out and finding someone that can talk about this language, they can learn about this language, and in fact, they also learned a little bit about themselves. This is sort of that reflexivity of that, right? They met Max on the road and they're like, oh yeah, we want to really talk to this guy, and he can give us this information, and they end up waiting around for him. And there's that one segment there where they're sort of complaining about how this guy is, late, and they have been waiting for weeks and months, and there's lots of preparation of getting there, and now they're having to wait around. And this was one of those sort of moments in which we see how our own culture sort of fits into the research, right? If we think about being American, one of the things that we focus on a lot is time, right? We have schedules, we create reminders in our calendars that we have to be in this meeting at some particular time, and that time becomes very important. If you're not early, you're late, right? If you're 5 minutes early, then you're on time, right? Our whole lives are, dictated by this scheduling. Lots of other cultures around the world do not have the same sort of shared concept of time. I remember experiencing what we would call Indian time, which I think is certainly a derogatory term. And it was this idea that we'd go want to have a meeting with a tribal council somewhere, and they'd say, "Yeah, be there at 9:30." And so we'd show up at 9:30, and then we'd wait till 10, and then we'd wait till 11, and then by 1:30, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, come on in." And we'd be sitting there fuming, right? Well, we had time, supposed to be here at 9:30. The same sort of value on time isn't held by everyone. And it's important to realize that when we're interacting with other cultures that don't live on that same sort of schedule, that it's not an affront to anyone. It's just different, right? And that's important to remember, especially when we see something as very important, and if people don't live up to that, right, they might not have those same sort of cultural expectations. And so for them to show up late isn't a big deal because it doesn't matter, right? It really doesn't matter to them. The idea of time is different, and that's okay, right? So from Bolivia, that I think those are two things that really focusing on the saving of that language for the medicinal use, and then I also appreciate that experience of time, and also they got sick, right? Got sick out there, and what it's like to actually be sick in another country and having to travel and camp and stuff, and it is miserable. And I've done that, and it sucks. And I think it's a great example of what it's like to actually do that kind of stuff. So yeah, good stuff there. Siberia, right? What it's like to be in Russia and looking at this language. I think it's really fascinating to look at sort of what it's like to find people that have had their language repressed by a larger society, right? So it's this relationship between a dying culture that might only have a few dozen speakers left, and a language like Russian, which has pushed or shoved or outright attacked language in its attempt to sort of destroy it. And then we saw in the scene where they're talking to the mayor of that town in Siberia, talking about how these folks were, basically like gutter, right? They couldn't drink like Russians could, right? They weren't as tough. And I think that's a great example of sort of that ethnocentrism that you might experience with some groups in different cultures when they look down upon another culture, especially a native culture to that region, right? Russia came in, colonized that area, and then those people, have had to deal with sort of the fallout, as many indigenous people do. So there's the struggle of finding those people, and then also finding key informants. And I think this is really important to understand. and of course I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, who is at first their guide, and then all of a sudden we find out that he is a fluent speaker within that language. And that's one of those things that is also indicative of a culture that has been repressed, right? When you have members of that society that refuse to reveal an aspect of their culture, that they know the language, they know the stuff that's going on, but do not wish to express it to outsiders because those outsiders can't be trusted. And if those outsiders can't be trusted, then they don't want to share it. They don't want to give themselves up. They've already been through the hassle of growing up in that community with sort of racist ideologies and cultural ideologies placed upon them as if they were less than, right? So, that's sort of this experience, what it's like. And this experience can be translated into um, Native Americans and indigenous peoples around the world, right? Especially when you've had a colonizing power come in and tell you that your culture and your language is bad or not right. And then it also shows what these guys do trying to help save that language, right? So recording the languages, and then also getting the community involved, right? Creating that book, right? The children's book that the kids had a part in making, of telling these stories, these traditional stories in traditional language, to help maintain the youth learning that language, so that that language can be passed on to another generation. The quickest way to lose a language is for the youth not to speak it, right? For it not to be taught. So, in this case, it becomes really important that that's one of those activities that these guys do. Then we go to India. India also has a really important experience to it, not only for sort of um, the community, the boarding school that they're dealing with, but also their experience outside in the field and sort of the pitfalls that you might fall into. So it starts out in India, and it starts out at this boarding school, right? So in India, there's somewhere in the range of like 240 million people that speak English as a language, as either a secondary language, or maybe even a first language, um, because of its commercial value, right? And I say that because English itself has been a huge um, sort of global force, right? Global economic force. And a lot of people in other countries have recognized this. And in this case, this boarding school is focused around not only learning the English language, but also generating skills for those students that can be applied for English commerce, right? So these are kids coming from all around India, from different tribes, and learning and acclimating to that sort of ideology of learning this language and why it's important to learn that language. So what they want to do is they want to go out and look at a couple of different languages, one in particular that allows them to sort of see this tribal language and understand its importance and maybe some of the uniqueness that comes along to it. So they go out and they travel to to this location, but to get there, it's kind of an arduous journey by train, and there's possible conflict that could take place. Anywhere that you do anthropological work, there's possible conflict where you might run into bandits, and I say bandits, and that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. there could be warring factions, there could be rebels, there could be, some sort of violence that could take place. That's a reality. I've run into it myself um, on a couple of different occasions, and it can be scary as all get out. But you learn to deal with those sort of circumstances, and we usually get along pretty fine afterwards. So along the way, they are experiencing some of these issues. They meet up with a couple of different groups. There's singing and dancing. There's the participant observation, right? Engaging in the community and learning about the community, not just taking notes and learning these specific things, but it's about getting in that community, creating those connections, experience what their life is like. And that's a great example of what it's like to do field work. And a lot of times it's spontaneous, right? Spontaneous things happen and you become a part of that moment. And it has changing effects, not only on you, but yourself having a changing effect on that community. So, that's kind of one of the big things um, that this part of the film is really talking about is that journey and that experience of getting yourself into it. And then I think one of the most fascinating things about the entire film is when they start talking to these to this folks, and of course I forget the name of the language at this moment, is that they have a unique way of counting, right? And why is that important? Well, it's a different way of seeing the world, and I think anytime that we do that, anytime that we can gain knowledge about someone's viewpoint, we can get a different perspective, and that helps. It doesn't hinder. So in this case, the thing that they were found fascinating was the counting, right? They were using a base 12 system and a base 20 system, which is absolutely fascinating. We ourselves use like base 10 and base 12. So it's not that far off, but it's how we go about it, right? They use a base 12 system and base 20 in a very unique way, right? They count to 12, and then when they get to 13, they go 12 plus 1, right? And then 12 plus 2 and 12 plus 3 until they get to 20, and then they do 20 plus 1 until they get to 32, which is 12 plus 20. And then they get to like 33, which is 12 plus 1 plus 20, right? And it's just like, wow, that seems like a bonkers way to count, but it creates a very different understanding about how they might see the world, right? And how they organize their world. And so I think it's important that we, capture and reflect those things, right? So, you know, I I think we also have to take into account, sort of going back to the boarding schools here, um, that in some ways they are creating an economic boon for these kids, right? That this is something that is going to benefit these kids. At the same time, boarding schools have a tendency to eradicate language and culture. Um, the Russians have used boarding schools to great extent. China is using them, India is using them, and then of course the United States and Canada use them extensively. And that's where we get to this last segment, talking about sort of the Native American experience in this film. Um, the fact that kids had been sent to boarding schools in which they were not allowed to speak their own language. In fact, oftentimes it was punishable to talk about their own language or their own culture. They were being westernized, Christianized, a lot of times even given like Christian names in order to fit into the broader Western world. And it was absolutely devastating to Native American cultures. It cannot be understated how much of an impact this policy had on Native American communities. And this started early in the 20th century, in which boarding schools were created. Um, and then these kids were taken away. In fact, it wasn't until 1978 with the Indian Child Welfare Act, um, in which the practice of forcibly removing children um, was ended, right? That is not that long ago, right? So your probably your grandparents and great grandparents' ages would have been within that era, right? Or where they could have been taken away. And I've spoken to a number of people who have lived that boarding school experience and understanding the damage that was done. A lot of those kids um, either never returned home, or if they did return home, they were completely changed by that boarding school experience because they might be gone for years, right? Um, and in that process, might have lost their native language, might have lost their given name, and all they have left is their Christian name, and that can devastate a culture, right? And if you have this generation or a couple generations that have lost language, lost that traditional knowledge, didn't grow up with it, then the following generation is going to have even less, right? And I think that's one of the lessons that we have to learn about, sort of especially our own American experience of what it was like for Native Americans to have their culture ripped away from them in an absolutely devastating way. Uh, and this is a long practice. Even in the original sort of like policy settings, dealing with um, boarding schools and this federal sort of mandate of doing so. The one of the policy ideas was kill the Indian to save the man, right? And the man being this anglicized Christian person, and eradicating the that native culture. Um, and yeah, there's no way of getting around the brutality of it. And of course, there's also lots of evidence, and has been for years. This is not just a recent thing. In Canada, they've been finding some mass graves with kids in them. You can find a lot of that here in the United States as well, where it's been documented that there are, graves of these kids uh, around these schools, and these kids never got sent home. Um, and died in tragic ways at these schools. And it is not. Uh, it's a dark period within our own culture, within sort of the American legacy, and I think we have a tendency to really focus on sort of American exceptionalism. And I think in this case we have to recognize sort of the dark side of what has happened here, because it falls in line with a bunch of other things that have also happened. So, again, when we think about this, especially when it comes to like boarding schools, forcibly taking children away from their homes, or in the case of like India, where a lot of times it's voluntary, and that has different effects there, or in Russia or in China, which is going on, and there's lots of significance going on there. These are things that we should be concerned about. So, yeah, sort of the whole analysis of this film, I think it's fantastic that it deals with each of these subjects in such a way that helps us to understand the importance of language, of how it helps us to understand, right, the worldviews of these people, and then what happens when those languages are lost or destroyed, and the impacts that it can have on those people. Okay, that's it for now. Think on some of that as we move forward, and we'll talk to you in the next one. All right, take it easy.